It was just a white van. That's the thing nobody tells you first. That the most dangerous predator in the history of Milwaukee, a man who would go on to murder 17 people, a man whose name would become synonymous with the darkest corners of human depravity, drove something as ordinary and forgettable as a white van. No custom paint job. No blacked-out windows. No warning signs painted on the side. Just a white van. Parked on a Milwaukee street. Engine idling. Driver's window cracked. And a man inside who was very, very good at one thing above all else. Making people feel safe. He had soft blue eyes and a quiet voice and a way of leaning in when you talked. Like what you were saying was the most interesting thing he'd ever heard. He'd offer a drink, a little money, a place to get out of the cold. He seemed harmless. He seemed lonely. He seemed, to the people who got into that van, like exactly the kind of person you didn't need to be afraid of. 17 people got into that van. Not one of them came back out alive. His name was Jeffrey Lionel Dahmer. He was born on May 21, 1960, in West Allis, Wisconsin. He liked tropical fish and chocolate milk and the band Kiss. He had a teddy bear named Cubby until he was 12 years old. And between 1978 and 1991, he committed crimes so monstrous that even seasoned homicide detectives, people who had spent careers confronting the worst of human nature, had to step outside and breathe when they heard the details. But here is what this story is really about. It's not about the crimes. Not primarily. It's about the system that let him continue. The neighbors who heard things and said nothing. The police who held a victim's hand, a living, breathing, terrified victim, and handed him back. It's about the racism and the indifference and the failures, layer upon layer, that allowed one man to operate in plain sight for 13 years. Jeffrey Dahmer was a monster. But he was also a product of a city, a time, and a system that looked the other way. Stay with me. Because what you're about to hear isn't just a horror story. It's a warning. Before Milwaukee. Before the white van. Before any of it, there was a quiet house on West Bath Road in Summit Township, Ohio. That's where Jeffrey Dahmer grew up. Or tried to. His father was Lionel Dahmer, a research chemist, methodical and emotionally distant, the kind of man who expressed love through problem-solving rather than presence. His mother was Joyce Dahmer, anxious, frequently ill, dependent on prescription medications, and prone to dramatic emotional episodes that left the household walking on eggshells. Jeffrey was their first child. By most accounts, he was a normal, cheerful toddler, curious, active, the kind of kid who lit up at animals and the outdoors. Then things began to shift. When Jeffrey was around 4 years old, his father performed a simple household task, clearing out the bones of small animals from beneath the family's house. Chipmunks, squirrels, the remains of whatever had crawled under there over the years. Lionel gathered the bones and put them in a bucket. And Jeffrey, 4-year-old Jeffrey, was fascinated. Not frightened. Not disgusted. Fascinated. He reached into the bucket and touched the bones, turning them over in his small hands, listening to the sound they made when they clattered together. His father, in his own memoir, recalled the look on the boy's face, that absorbed private delight, and felt a chill he couldn't fully explain. He dismissed it. Children are strange. Children are drawn to odd things. But something had been set in motion. Something that nobody caught, nobody treated, nobody interrupted. By the time Jeffrey was in his early teens, he was collecting roadkill. Not as a prank, not as a dare, alone, deliberately, in the Ohio countryside, gathering the carcasses of animals he found on roadsides and experimenting with them. He called the collection his experiments. He dissolved the flesh in acid, a technique he'd learned by watching his father handle chemicals in the lab. He kept the bones. He was also, by this point, deeply isolated. Awkward. He'd developed a coping mechanism that would follow him his entire life: drinking. Beer, mostly, consumed in secret, starting in his early teens. He'd fill a bag with cans before school and drink on the bus. His parents divorced when he was 18. His mother left and took his younger brother with her. His father, preoccupied with a new relationship, moved out too. Jeffrey Dahmer was left alone in the family home. 18 years old. Completely unsupervised. And already fantasizing about things that would make your blood run cold. The first murder was 3 weeks later. June 18, 1978. A Saturday. Hot, clear Ohio summer. Jeffrey Dahmer was 18 years old, alone in the family home, and hitchhiking had become one of the ways he passed time. A young man named Stephen Mark Hicks was also hitchhiking that day. He was 19, tanned, long-haired, on his way to a rock concert, in good spirits. He'd had a solid day. He accepted a ride from the quiet young man with the blue eyes who said he had beer back at his place. They drove to the Dahmer house. They drank together on the back patio. They talked. By several accounts, it was a pleasant afternoon between two young men with nothing particular in common except youth, and a summer afternoon with nothing else to do. Then Hicks said he needed to leave. Jeffrey Dahmer did not want him to leave. What happened next, Dahmer would describe decades later in chilling, clinical detail during police interviews, with a flat, measured effect of someone recounting something that had happened to someone else entirely. He picked up a barbell from behind Hicks and struck him twice across the back of the skull. He strangled him with the barbell. He buried the body. Then he dug the body up, dismembered it, dissolved the flesh in acid, and scattered the crushed bones in the woods behind the house. Stephen Hicks was reported missing. His family searched for years. A case was opened, went cold, stayed cold. Jeffrey Dahmer's father came home to find his son alone and agitated. He assumed it was the stress of his parents' divorce. Nobody found Stephen Hicks for 13 years. And Jeffrey Dahmer, having committed a murder at 18, having disposed of a body so thoroughly that it vanished entirely, having lived with what he'd done for weeks in an empty house, went on with his life. He enrolled in Ohio State University that fall. He dropped out after one semester, his attendance destroyed by drinking. His father, desperate to give him direction, sent him to join the U.S. Army. The Army, it turned out, would provide Jeffrey Dahmer with unstructured time, alcohol access, and, most critically, more victims. Jeffrey Dahmer served in the U.S. Army from 1979 to 1981. He was stationed in Baumholder, West Germany, where he worked as a combat medic. He was, by most accounts of his fellow soldiers, an unremarkable serviceman. Quiet. Competent enough. Kept to himself. He drank constantly. His commanding officers documented his alcohol problem in his service records. He was passed over for promotions. He was eventually discharged, not dishonorably, but early, for alcohol-related misconduct. Two soldiers stationed with Dahmer in Germany later told investigators that they had experienced something during that posting that they couldn't fully explain at the time and that haunted them afterward. They reported waking in their barracks with vague, dreamlike memories of being unable to move. Of Dahmer being nearby. The investigators heard this. Wrote it down. And when they looked at the timeline, at the gap in Dahmer's known murders, they wondered, for years, whether the actual body count was higher than anyone knew. It has never been confirmed. After his discharge, Dahmer drifted to Miami Beach, Florida, where he lived in a motel and worked at a deli counter for nearly a year. He later told investigators he had gone there specifically to get away from Wisconsin, and from the grave he'd left behind in Ohio. But he couldn't run from himself. In 1982, broke and unemployed, he called his grandmother. Catherine Dahmer, his paternal grandmother, a gentle, church-going woman from West Allis, Wisconsin, told him he could come stay with her. That she'd help him get on his feet. Catherine Dahmer loved her grandson without reservation. She would spend 9 years trying to understand the man who lived in her basement. And she would never fully know what he was. From 1982 to 1987, Jeffrey Dahmer lived in his grandmother Catherine's home in West Allis, Wisconsin. On the surface, it looked like recovery. He got a job. He attended church with his grandmother. He was polite to neighbors, helpful around the house. Catherine adored having him. She told friends and family she thought Jeffrey just needed stability, needed someone to believe in him. But beneath the surface, the compulsions were building. In 1982, Dahmer was arrested for indecent exposure at the Wisconsin State Fair, exposing himself in front of a crowd that included children. He was fined. In 1986, he was arrested again for exposing himself to 2 boys near a river. He told the judge he had been urinating, not exposing himself. He received a year of probation. His grandmother was never told the truth about these arrests. And the fantasies were intensifying. Dahmer later told investigators that throughout the years at his grandmother's house, he had been visiting bathhouses, developing increasingly violent sexual fantasies, consuming extreme pornography, and experimenting with drugging men at bathhouses, slipping substances into their drinks and watching what happened. He was expelled from at least one bathhouse for this behavior. He reported these incidents to no one. He sought no help. He told no one what was happening inside his head. Not his father, not his grandmother, not any of the counselors or probation officers who intersected briefly with his life. And then, on September 8, 1987, the killing began again. 9 years after Stephen Hicks. His name was Stephen Twomey. He was 26 years old. He and Dahmer met at a bar, went together to a hotel room at the Ambassador Hotel in Milwaukee, and by morning, Stephen Twomey was dead. Dahmer claimed, in later interviews, that he had no memory of killing Twomey, that he woke up to find him dead and simply acted. Bought a large suitcase, put the body in it, taxied it back to his grandmother's basement. Stephen Twomey has never been found. He was the first of the Milwaukee victims. He would not be the last. Before we go further into the mechanics of what happened, we stop here. We stop because this is the part that the news coverage always rushes through. The part that the true crime genre, at its worst, treats as a footnote. The part that Jeffrey Dahmer's infamy has, for decades, obscured. The 17 people Jeffrey Dahmer murdered were not supporting characters in his story. They were the story. Stephen Twomey was 26. He loved music and had moved to Milwaukee hoping to build a life. James Dockstader was 14 years old. 14. A child. He had run away from home and was living on the streets. Richard Guerrero was 25. His family spent years searching for him, posting flyers, calling police, begging for information. They were told, repeatedly, that young men sometimes just leave. Anthony Sears was 24. He was handsome, ambitious, working toward becoming a model. His family described him as the light of every room he entered. Raymond Smith was 33, known to his friends as Ricky. He was a father. He had people who loved him and people who depended on him. Edward Smith was 27. Ernest Miller was 22, a dance student with a fierce passion for performing. David Thomas was 22, a father to a 4-year-old daughter who would grow up without him. Curtis Straughter was 18. Errol Lindsay was 19. Tony Hughes was 31, deaf and mute since childhood, a man who communicated with a lightness and humor that everyone who knew him remembered immediately. Conorak Synthesumphone was 14 years old. 14 years old. A Laotian immigrant whose family had survived unimaginable hardship to build a life in Milwaukee. Matt Turner was 20. Jeremiah Weinberger was 23. Oliver Lacey was 23. Joseph Braidhoft was 25. 17 people. 17 complete, irreplaceable human lives. Most of them were gay or bisexual men of color. Most of them were young. Most of them were from communities that, in Milwaukee in the 1980s, the police did not particularly prioritize. This is not incidental. This is central. Jeffrey Dahmer chose his victims deliberately. He chose people he believed, correctly as it turned out, that the system would not urgently search for. People whose disappearances would generate less alarm. People who could vanish and be explained away. He was right. And that truth is as damning as anything else in this story. In 1988, Catherine Dahmer asked her grandson to find his own place. She didn't know what he was. She had noticed, with growing unease, the smells from the basement, the strange hours, the locked doors. She had found things she couldn't explain. But she was an elderly woman who loved her grandson, and the human capacity for not seeing what we cannot bear to see is enormous. So she asked him, gently, lovingly, to find his own apartment. He found one at 924 North 25th Street, Milwaukee. Apartment 213. The Oxford Apartments was a modest, 3-story building in the predominantly African-American neighborhood of Midtown Milwaukee. It was the kind of building where people minded their own business, where rent was low enough for people living paycheck to paycheck, where the hallways smelled of other people's dinners and the walls were thin. Dahmer moved in and immediately began what neighbors would later describe as a campaign of odors and sounds that defied explanation, and yet somehow never quite triggered the intervention that might have saved lives. There were smells. Awful, persistent, chemical smells. Neighbors complained. The building manager investigated. Dahmer told them he was curing fish, or that his refrigerator had a dead animal in it from a power outage. He was believed. Or rather, he was believed enough. Nobody pushed hard enough to find out the truth. There were sounds. A buzzsaw late at night. Power tools running at 2 a.m. Neighbors knocked on the wall. The sounds stopped. Nobody called the police. There was a drum, a large blue industrial drum, 57 gallons, that Dahmer had delivered to his apartment. Neighbors saw it, thought it was odd, said nothing. Inside that drum, Dahmer dissolved the remains of his victims in acid. He did this in a Milwaukee apartment building, surrounded by neighbors, while holding down a job at a chocolate factory. His co-workers said he was quiet and kept to himself. His supervisors said he was a reliable, if unmotivated, worker. Nobody knew. Nobody looked. Jeffrey Dahmer was not physically imposing. He was not a man who could overpower victims through brute force alone. What he had was something more useful and more terrifying. He was extraordinarily good at being non-threatening. His method was consistent. He would go to gay bars, bathhouses, or shopping malls in Milwaukee's downtown. He would identify a target, almost always a young man, often a man of color, often someone who was economically vulnerable. He would approach them with the easy confidence of someone who simply wanted company. He'd offer money to pose for photographs. He'd offer alcohol, a place to watch a movie, a meal. He was charming. He made people laugh. He seemed genuinely interested in them. At his apartment, he would make drinks. Into those drinks, he would crush sleeping tablets, sometimes multiple doses. He would wait for the drugs to take effect. And then he would kill. The methods evolved. The compulsions deepened. Dahmer later told investigators, with the same flat, cooperative tone he maintained throughout his confessions, that he had begun to develop what he described as a desire for permanent companionship. That he was terrified of being alone. That he killed because he wanted people to stay. He preserved portions of his victims. He photographed them. He kept skulls, 17 of them, carefully cleaned and stored. Investigators found them in his apartment on July 22, 1991. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Because between 1988 and 1991, Dahmer was arrested, convicted, and sentenced. And released. And nobody connected the dots. In September 1988, Jeffrey Dahmer lured a 13-year-old Laotian boy named Somsak Synthesumphone to his apartment. He drugged him. He sexually assaulted him. The boy escaped. He told his parents. His parents called the police. Dahmer was arrested. He was charged with second-degree sexual assault and enticing a child for immoral purposes. He told the court, and his attorney made this argument with a straight face, that he had thought the boy was older. That it was a misunderstanding. That he was a troubled young man who needed help, not incarceration. He was sentenced to 1 year in a work release program and 5 years of probation. He served 10 months. And here is where you need to stop and sit with what comes next. The boy Dahmer assaulted in 1988, Somsak Synthesumphone, had a younger brother. His name was Konarak Synthesumphone. Konarak was 14 years old in 1991 when Jeffrey Dahmer lured him to apartment 213. In May 1991, while Dahmer was still on probation for the assault on Konarak's older brother, Konarak managed to escape from the apartment. He stumbled outside, dazed, drugged, bleeding. He was found on the street by 2 women, Sandra Smith and Nicole Childress, who called 911 immediately. The police arrived. 2 officers, John Balcerzak and Joseph Gabrish, responded to the call. What happened next is one of the most consequential failures in the history of American law enforcement. Dahmer came out of the apartment building, calm and composed. He told the officers that Konarak was his 19-year-old boyfriend. That they'd had a lover's quarrel. That the boy was drunk and confused. He was believed. The officers called it in as a domestic incident. They escorted Konarak back up to apartment 213, back into the hands of the man who had drugged him and intended to kill him. One officer noted the smell of the apartment. Noted it in his radio communication. Did not investigate it. Sandra Smith and Nicole Childress, watching from across the street, pleaded with the officers. They said the boy was clearly a child. They said something was wrong. They were dismissed. One officer was recorded, in the radio call, making a joke. That night, Jeffrey Dahmer murdered Konarak Synthesumphone. The two officers, Balcerzak and Gabrish, were eventually fired. They appealed. They were reinstated. John Balcerzak later became president of the Milwaukee Police Association. Glenda Cleveland, the mother of Sandra Smith, who had also called police separately that night, spent months trying to get someone to listen. She was told the matter had been resolved. She would spend the rest of her life speaking about what happened on that street corner and what it cost. This is the part of the story that deserves its own documentary, its own reckoning, its own sustained national attention. Because Jeffrey Dahmer did not operate in a vacuum. He operated in a community that was raising alarms, loudly, persistently, specifically, and being systematically ignored. The neighborhood around the Oxford apartments was a black community. The men Dahmer targeted were, predominantly, men of color. Their families, their friends, their neighbors were reporting concerns, filing missing persons reports, begging investigators to connect the disappearances. Dahmer's neighbor Pamela Bass later said that she had smelled things from his apartment that no reasonable explanation could account for. She had said something. Nothing happened. The building manager had fielded multiple complaints. He had spoken to Dahmer multiple times. He accepted his explanations. Families of missing men, the Guerreros, the Smiths, the Thomases, described going to the Milwaukee Police Department and feeling dismissed. Feeling like their missing loved ones were not being taken seriously. Feeling like the police saw young black and brown men who frequented gay bars as people who simply left, simply disappeared, simply weren't worth the urgency of a genuine investigation. Investigators, to their credit, have since acknowledged this. Former officials of the Milwaukee Police Department have publicly acknowledged that the department's response to missing persons reports from communities of color was inadequate. That homophobia and racism infected the institutional response in ways that cost lives. But acknowledgement, after the fact, does not bring anyone home. And while the community was raising alarms that weren't answered, Dahmer kept working. He kept driving that white van through the streets. He kept offering drinks. He kept killing. By the summer of 1991, he was murdering at a rate of roughly one person per week. He was on probation. He had a scheduled check-in with his probation officer on July 22, 1991. He never made it. July 22, 1991. A Monday night. The kind of humid Milwaukee summer heat that makes the city feel compressed and close. Tracy Edwards was 32 years old, visiting Milwaukee from Mississippi. He was friendly and talkative, and when a quiet man with blue eyes approached him near a bar and offered him $100 to pose for some photographs, he accepted. They took a cab to 924 North 25th Street. Apartment 213. Inside, Dahmer made drinks. Edwards later said the apartment felt wrong immediately, a smell he couldn't quite identify, an atmosphere that put every instinct he had on edge. But he was already inside, and the door was closed, and the man was calm and friendly and nothing overt had happened yet. Then Dahmer snapped a handcuff onto Edwards's wrist. He couldn't get the second cuff on. Edwards resisted, talked fast, kept Dahmer engaged, kept the situation from escalating to violence through sheer force of personality and refusal to show fear. For 5 hours, Tracy Edwards sat in apartment 213, negotiating for his life. He watched Dahmer rock back and forth, watching a horror movie, pressing his head to Edwards's chest to listen to his heartbeat. He watched Dahmer pick up a knife. And then, in a moment of absolute courage, Tracy Edwards punched Jeffrey Dahmer in the face, shoved past him, and ran. He ran out of the building and flagged down a patrol car on the street. Officers Robert Roth and Rolf Mueller followed him back to the building. Dahmer met them at the door, calm as always, and attempted the charm that had worked so many times before. It didn't work this time. The officers insisted on entering. They asked to check the apartment. Dahmer refused. They pushed past him. What Officer Mueller found in the refrigerator, what he saw when he opened that door, made him physically recoil. He called out to his partner. His voice, according to Tracy Edwards who was in the hallway, had changed completely. He said, "Call for backup." And then, "There's a head in here." What the Milwaukee police found in apartment 213 on the night of July 22, 1991 has been documented in official reports, court testimony, and investigators' memoirs. I am going to tell you only what is necessary to understand the full weight of what Jeffrey Dahmer had done. Not for shock. Not for sensation. Because you need to understand what 13 years of unchecked evil looks like when it is finally, fully exposed. In the refrigerator, a human head. 3 more in the freezer. On the shelves of a closet, 3 human skulls, painted, preserved. In a filing cabinet, 2 more skulls. In the large blue industrial drum, the dissolving remains of 3 victims. Photographs, Polaroids, dozens of them, documenting what Dahmer had done to his victims at every stage. Scattered throughout the apartment, bones. Human bones, processed, preserved, catalogued with a care that investigators found more disturbing, in some ways, than the violence itself. 17 victims in total. He confessed to all of them. He sat across from investigators, cooperative and precise, and described each killing with the same measured, almost academic tone. The detectives who conducted those interviews have spoken, in the years since, about what it cost them. About the nightmares. About the moments where they had to set down their pens and step outside. Dahmer told them everything. He answered every question. He seemed almost relieved. He told investigators that he had wanted to stop. That he had prayed to stop. That he had tried to stop. That he could not. The question of whether Jeffrey Dahmer was legally sane, whether he understood the wrongfulness of his actions, would become the central question of his trial. It would not be an easy question to answer. In the weeks following Jeffrey Dahmer's arrest, law enforcement agencies across the country began the grim task of connecting the dots. 13 years of dots. The Milwaukee Police Department, working with the FBI, established a task force specifically dedicated to building the full scope of Dahmer's crimes. They began with what they had, the physical evidence in apartment 213, the photographs, the bones, Dahmer's own confessions, and worked outward. The missing persons reports they pulled told a story that was, in its own way, as devastating as the murders themselves. Report after report after report of young men, young black and brown men, primarily, who had vanished from Milwaukee streets and whose cases had never been properly investigated. Cases that had been filed and forgotten. Cases where families had been told their loved ones had probably just moved on. Cases where the detective had taken a brief statement, done a cursory check, and moved to the next file. The FBI behavioral analysts who consulted on the case noted, in their internal reports, that Dahmer's victim selection was not random. It was strategic. He had identified a population that the system would not urgently protect. He had operated within that understanding with the confidence of someone who had tested it and found it true. He had. In Ohio, investigators went back to the woods behind the old Dahmer family property in Bath Township. They found bone fragments. They found what remained of Stephen Hicks, 13 years in the earth, scattered, but there. The Hicks family, which had never stopped searching, was finally given an answer. It did not feel like closure. It never does. The army records were pulled. The Germany posting was reviewed. The soldiers who had reported strange experiences were re-interviewed. No additional confirmed victims were identified from that period. But investigators noted, quietly, that the absence of confirmed victims was not the same as their absence. The Syntha-Sumphone family, Somsack, who had survived Dahmer's 1988 assault, and the family of Konarak, who had not survived his 1991 encounter, faced a reality that no family should have to face. They had been in the system. They had reported what happened to Somsack. And the system had released the man who did it, on probation, to do it again, to one of their own children. The weight of that is not measurable. The trial of Jeffrey Lionel Dahmer began on January 30, 1992, at the Milwaukee County Courthouse. He was charged with 15 counts of first-degree intentional homicide, the Wisconsin killings. The Ohio murder of Stephen Hicks was handled separately. Dahmer pleaded guilty to all 15 counts. The trial was therefore not about guilt. It was about one question. Was Jeffrey Dahmer legally sane? Under Wisconsin law, a defendant is legally insane if, as a result of a mental disease or defect, they lack the capacity to appreciate the wrongfulness of their conduct. Dahmer's defense attorney, Gerald Boyle, argued that Dahmer suffered from necrophilia and a paraphilic disorder so severe that it rendered him legally insane, that he was driven by compulsions he could not control and that he did not understand, in any meaningful sense, the wrongfulness of what he did. The prosecution, led by District Attorney E. Michael McCann, argued the opposite. That Dahmer's methodical planning, the drugging, the careful disposal of evidence, the lies he told to police and neighbors, the years he spent concealing his crimes, all demonstrated a man who knew exactly what he was doing was wrong and took elaborate steps to avoid consequences. They argued that knowing something is wrong and being compelled to do it anyway is not insanity. It is evil. Both sides brought expert witnesses. Psychiatrists and psychologists filed into the witness box and delivered opinions that contradicted each other with complete professional conviction. The jury heard about necrophilia and borderline personality disorder and antisocial personality disorder and psychosis. They heard about his drinking and his childhood and the bones under his grandmother's house and the drum of acid in his apartment. They deliberated for 5 hours. On February 15, 1992, the jury returned a verdict. Guilty. Guilty on all 15 counts. Sane. Jeffrey Dahmer was sentenced to 15 consecutive life terms, 957 years in prison. He would serve 2 years and 10 months. At sentencing, the families of Dahmer's victims were given the opportunity to address the court. This is the part of the trial that the cameras captured and that the news covered briefly and that most people who followed the case have, over the decades, largely forgotten. It should not be forgotten. Shirley Hughes, mother of Tony Hughes, the deaf man, the one who communicated with such warmth that everyone who knew him felt it immediately, stood in that courtroom and spoke directly to Jeffrey Dahmer. She told him what her son was. She told him what she had lost. She did not scream. She did not collapse. She stood straight and she spoke clearly and she made the courtroom understand, in 3 minutes, that a number, 17, was not an abstraction. The families of Raymond Smith, of Ernest Miller, of Curtis Trotter, of David Thomas, they all came. They all spoke. They used their time not to perform grief for cameras but to insist on a simple and radical act. That their children be seen. That their children be remembered. That the man in that courtroom look at what he had taken. Dahmer sat and listened. He later addressed the court himself. His statement was long, carefully composed, delivered with the same controlled effect he'd maintained throughout. He expressed remorse. He said he wished he could give his life to bring the victims back. He said he was glad he had been caught, because he knew he would not have stopped. Whether that remorse was real, whether Jeffrey Dahmer was capable of real remorse, is a question that psychiatrists and criminologists have debated for 30 years. What is not debatable is this. The families who sat in that courtroom deserved more than a courtroom. They deserved a world in which their children never got into that van. A world in which the police listened when they reported their loved ones missing. A world in which a 14-year-old boy, stumbling drugged and bleeding down a Milwaukee street, was taken to a hospital and not handed back to his killer. That world did not exist for them. Jeffrey Dahmer was sent to the Columbia Correctional Institution in Portage, Wisconsin. For the first year, he was kept in solitary confinement for his own protection. Prison populations do not respond warmly to men who have done what Dahmer had done. He was eventually integrated into a small group of inmates with their own work detail and a degree of structured interaction. He became, by prison staff accounts, a model inmate. He was quiet. He was cooperative. He read voraciously, primarily religious texts. He had, during the trial, begun to explore Christianity with what appeared to be genuine commitment. He was baptized in May 1994 by Roy Ratcliffe, a Church of Christ minister who visited him in prison regularly. Ratcliffe later wrote about his experiences with Dahmer. He described a man who was grappling, with whatever capacity he had for genuine reflection, with the enormity of what he had done. Who prayed? Who asked questions? Who seemed to believe he deserved his punishment and feared there was no forgiveness available to him. Ratcliffe believed the faith was real. Others who interacted with Dahmer in prison were less certain. His father Lionel visited. They had a complicated relationship to navigate, a father who had raised a boy without understanding what was growing inside him, who had written a searching, agonized memoir trying to understand how it happened. Lionel Dahmer's own grief and guilt were palpable and human. His son received him. Dahmer gave his first, and only, major television interview from prison to Stone Phillips of Dateline NBC. He was composed, articulate, and seemingly remorseful. He said he did not think he deserved to be called a human being. He said he would understand if his victims' families never forgave him. He said he hoped that his case might help someone else, help identify the warning signs, get someone help before they became what he had become. He seemed to mean it. Or he had learned, so thoroughly, how to seem to mean it that no one could tell the difference. On November 28, 1994, 2 years and 10 months after his sentencing, Jeffrey Dahmer was assigned to a work detail in the prison gymnasium. He was beaten to death by a fellow inmate named Christopher Scarver. He was 34 years old. Christopher Scarver was 25 years old and serving a life sentence for murder when he was assigned to the same work detail as Jeffrey Dahmer on November 28, 1994. He later told journalists and investigators that he had been troubled by Dahmer's presence in the prison. That Dahmer would, according to Scarver, fashion food in the prison cafeteria into shapes meant to disturb other inmates, making food look like severed limbs, drizzling ketchup over it to suggest blood. Scarver said Dahmer would poke other inmates with his finger while they worked and then act as if nothing had happened. Whether all of this is accurate is impossible to verify now. What is accurate is what happened in the gymnasium bathroom that November morning. Scarver was left alone with Dahmer and another inmate, Jesse Anderson. A guard stepped out. Scarver used a metal bar from a weight machine. Dahmer was beaten so severely that he died approximately 1 hour later at Divine Savior Hospital. Jesse Anderson, who had nothing to do with Dahmer's crimes but who was also on the work detail, was beaten as well and died 2 days later. Scarver later said, in an interview, that he had done what he did because God had spoken to him. Because someone had to. The reaction to Dahmer's death was complicated and human and honest, the way grief in extreme circumstances always is. Some of the victims' family members said they felt relief. Some said they had wanted him to live longer, to sit in that prison for the full 957 years, to feel the weight of every year. Some said they felt nothing at all, that they had been feeling nothing for a long time. Shirley Hughes, mother of Tony, said, "I don't rejoice in anyone's death. But now he knows what it feels like. That is not vengeance. That is a mother saying something true." In the years following Dahmer's death, Milwaukee undertook, partially, imperfectly, but genuinely, a reckoning with what had happened in its streets. The Oxford apartments at 924 North 25th Street were demolished in November 1992. The lot sat empty for years. It was eventually converted into a garden. A quiet, unremarkable patch of green in a neighborhood that bore scars the garden could not heal. The Milwaukee Police Department conducted internal reviews of its response to missing persons reports, to the synthesumphone incident, to the complaints that had come from the neighborhood around the Oxford apartments. The reviews found institutional failures, found evidence that race and sexual orientation had affected the urgency with which cases were investigated. The findings were noted. Some reforms were implemented. Some officers faced consequences. Many did not. Officers Balcerzak and Gabrish, the two who had returned Conarak's synthesumphone to Dahmer, were fired after the story broke. Their union fought for their reinstatement. They were reinstated. Balcerzak, as noted, later became president of the Milwaukee Police Association. Glenda Cleveland, who had called police 3 times on the night of the Conarak incident, who had tried with everything she had to get someone to listen, received no official acknowledgement for years. She continued to speak about what she had witnessed until her death in 2011. She was 63 years old. The city settled lawsuits filed by the families of Dahmer's victims. Settlements are not justice. They are an acknowledgement, in the only language institutions speak fluently, that something went wrong. For the families, money was never the point. The point was that their children deserved to be searched for. That their disappearances deserved urgency. That the color of their skin and who they loved should not have determined whether the police came running or whether the police filed a form and moved on. That point has still not been fully heard. Jeffrey Dahmer has become, in the decades since his death, something of a grotesque cultural phenomenon. There have been movies, documentaries, miniseries. A 2022 Netflix dramatization, Monster, The Jeffrey Dahmer Story, was watched by 196 million households in its first month of release. It broke streaming records. It also broke something else. The families of Dahmer's victims spoke out, powerfully, publicly, and with justified anger, about having been contacted by neither Netflix nor the producers before the series aired. About having to relive their children's murders and the coverage of their murders without warning, without preparation, without any recognition that they still existed and still had feelings and still bore wounds. Errol Lindsay's sister, Rita Isbell, whose victim impact statement at Dahmer's sentencing has been replicated in the series, said she felt like Netflix was re-traumatizing them for money. She was right to say it. The true crime genre, of which this video is a part, carries a responsibility that it does not always meet. The responsibility to center victims, not perpetrators. To tell the stories of the 17 people who were murdered with the same detail and humanity that gets devoted to the man who killed them. To ask not just how did he do this, but why did the system let him, and who is still failing the same communities today. Because Jeffrey Dahmer did not emerge from nowhere. He emerged from a specific set of circumstances, a childhood that needed intervention and didn't get it, a criminal justice system that prioritized some victims over others, a social environment in which gay men and men of color were less protected, less believed, and less mourned. Those circumstances did not end with Jeffrey Dahmer. They are the circumstances we still live in. This is where we end. Not with Jeffrey Dahmer. With them. Stephen Mark Hicks. 19 years old. He was hitchhiking to a rock concert on a summer day in Ohio. He was the kind of person who said yes to things, who got into the car, who trusted the world to be what it looked like. He deserved to make it to that concert and come home sunburned and happy. James Dockstader. 14 years old. He was a runaway, which means he was a child who needed help, who needed someone to find him before someone else did. The system had failed him before Dahmer found him. Dahmer was the final failure. Richard Guerrero. 25. His sister Janie spent years, after his disappearance, calling the Milwaukee Police Department. She described, in later interviews, what it felt like to be told, again and again, that her brother had probably just moved on. That young men did this. That she shouldn't worry. Anthony Sears. 24. Handsome and ambitious and full of plans. Raymond Smith. 33. A father. A son. A person who was loved. Edward Smith. 27. Ernest Miller. 22. David Thomas. 22. Curtis Straughter. 18 years old. He had his whole life in front of him. Errol Lindsay. 19. His sister stood in a courtroom and looked the man who killed him in the eye and said his name like it was a prayer. Tony Hughes. 31. Deaf since childhood. He used his hands to talk and his face to tell you everything. Everyone who knew him said the same thing, that Tony made a room brighter by being in it. Conorak Synthesumphone. 14. He had already survived so much. His family had survived war, displacement, the terrifying process of building a life in a strange country. And he was 14, and he ran, and 2 police officers brought him back. Matt Turner. 20. Jeremiah Weinberger. 23. He was the last person to see Dahmer before the arrest, the second-to-last victim, and his family spent years learning to live with being so close to the edge of saving him. Oliver Lacey. 23. He had a son. His son grew up without him. Joseph Braidhoft. 25. The last. Murdered on July 12, 1991, 10 days before Tracy Edwards ran from the apartment and flagged down a police car and ended it. If Joseph Braidhoft had been abducted 10 days later, if Dahmer had tried to lure someone on July 22nd instead of July 12th, he might be alive today. He might be 57 years old, watching his grandchildren grow up, remembering a summer in Milwaukee he got through. He was not. And that is the thing about these stories, the 10-day gap between Joseph Braidhoft and the arrest. The 8-hour gap between officers Balcerzak and Gabrish returning Conorak's Synthesumphone and his death. The 9-year gap between Stephen Hicks and the next murder. 9 years in which something, anything, might have intervened. The gaps are the story. The gaps are the thing that keeps us awake. Jeffrey Dahmer is dead. He has been dead for 30 years. He is not the lesson. The lesson is Glenda Cleveland on that sidewalk, phone in her hand, watching a police car drive away. The lesson is Janie Guerrero calling the Milwaukee Police Department and being told not to worry. The lesson is a 14-year-old boy, stumbling out of a building on a summer night, finding 2 officers who saw what they expected to see instead of what was in front of them. The lesson is that the systems we build to protect the most vulnerable among us are only as good as our willingness to see those people as worth protecting. We failed 17 people. We know their names. We owe them more than a documentary. We owe them a world that does better. Outro. Narrator. If this story stayed with you, and I hope it did, I'd ask you to do one thing. Learn the names of the 17 victims. Not Dahmer's name. Theirs. Look them up. Read about who they were before that white van, before that apartment, before any of this. They were whole people. They deserve to be remembered as whole people. Links are in the description, resources for the families of missing persons, information about the advocacy work being done in the names of Dahmer's victims, and the full list of the 17. Subscribe if you want to keep hearing stories told with the seriousness they deserve. And share this. Not for the views. For them.